Let me start by taking the two major developments of the last week, the last couple of days, that are the heavy focus of international press attention. Uh, when I say a heavy focus, there's very little clarity that's emerged from that focus. And because they ignore the underlying dynamic, which we just heard from Lyndon LaRouche, what is the actual process by which history unfolds. But I'm going to take a look at two of these events and then give you a little bit of take two other things that happened that show a different process. So let's start with President Zelensky's trip to the United States, which occurred last week, and on the surface was a flop. He was brought here to try to reverse the efforts to withhold funds for Ukraine. It was clear that the Congress has pulled back from that. Perhaps the intent of having him spin his magic before the Congress was the idea, but it was a flop. The idea of giving $60 billion more dollars to Ukraine, or to spread it around the various corporations and the defense contractors and Zelensky's cronies, that's no longer considered a good investment. The counteroffensive failed. Public opinion has turned on the Ukraine war. And the spectacular side of this flop was that all Republicans voted against providing more funds after they heard from Zelensky. Most exemplary was that of Lindsey Graham, who has been bragging about how it's such a great deal to provide $113 billion to Ukraine to kill Russians. That's a great deal. Now he's saying it's no longer a great deal. So there's speculation then, why do this? Why bring Zelensky knowing that there probably would be no shift in the Congress? Is it preparation for dumping him as president? Is there a change in strategy? Both those things may be at play here. I have no specific intelligence to say one way or the other. But what I can tell you is that the intent overall is clear: to keep the war going, to bleed Russia, and to continue the attacks on Putin and the nation of Russia. And the reason for that is not so obvious because you never hear about it. It's to stop the emergence of a new multipolar order, breaking with the unipolar order that is represented by the policies of the Anglo-Americans. So that's the Zelensky flop. Now, the second one, and it's probably another flop, was the trip of Jake Sullivan to Southwest Asia. Now, what we're told is he was sent to deliver a message to Netanyahu following the UN General Assembly vote, which Dennis mentioned, 150 plus nations voting for ceasefire, only 14 opposed. The US protection of Netanyahu is becoming a liability. The United States is isolated. The whole world is moving in a different direction, including voices within Israel, typified by the former Shin Bet head Ami Ayalon, who has said repeatedly recently, there's no military victory over Hamas. The Israelis have to move to a political policy, which includes a two-state solution. That's the only way to guarantee peace. The military can't guarantee peace for Israel. But when Sullivan went there and told them that they need a less intense bombardment of the population in general, and instead a more precise targeting of Hamas. Well, is that happening? Well, it's hard to see, but what is clear is that Netanyahu maintains his position that there will be no Palestinian state, and the policy of the war seems to be that there'll be no more Palestinians left in Palestine. So in both of these cases, the Zelensky visit and the Sullivan visit, the Biden is operating with a losing hand, and his NATO allies as well. There's no exit strategy. The continued war means more casualties, more economic distress, more isolation of the United States. But as I said, the broader purpose of this is the attack on the BRICS, the attack on the emergence of the global South as a break with the unipolar order. Now, that's the underlying dynamic in which the Ukraine war and the Gaza war are occurring. Look, it's clear that there are backstories here that go back a way. With Ukraine, you could go back to the period of the Soviet Union. You could start with the collapse of the Soviet Union. You could start with the Maidan coup. The media never does that. They start with February 2022. But there is a backstory on Ukraine, as well as on Israel. It's a much longer backstory that goes back to the Balfour Declaration. It goes back to the Sykes-Picot Treaty, and so on. But the overall dynamic is being defined by this breakout from the unipolar order. And two ways to look at that are two other events of the last days. The Putin National Press Conference on December 14th, where he had took dozens of questions from people from all over Russia, and also the European Council Summit, which took place on the 14th and 15th of December. So what insights can we draw for the shape of things to come from looking at those two things? And let me just start by saying that the reason you don't know much about these things is you're a victim of the censorship disinformation complex. That these dynamics, these underlying dynamics, are not covered. The idea that there's a revolt against colonialism. And let me simply say that if you look at whatever you think of Hamas, the Palestinians are a colonial oppressed people. That this is a part of the broader anti-colonial rebellion going on in the world, which is part of the emergence of a new order. So let's just start with the Putin press conference and take a quick look at a couple of things there. Almost 4 hours of questions he took. And imagine Joe Biden taking questions for 40 minutes, maybe even 10 minutes. But Putin had some tough questions. These were not all softballs. There were questions about problems veterans are facing, the cost of living concerns of the average people, and he took the questions head on. But on what he said about the present strategic situation, I think is the most important, and that's what I want to focus on. If I could have the first poster, please, first slide. Putin discussed this question of what is the rules-based order. And he said, as for the rules-based order, there are no such rules in reality. They change every day depending on the current political situation and the immediate interests of whoever is talking about it. How will this affect the situation? It will affect it in the right direction. It will show that there are quite a large number of forces in the world, powerful countries, that want to live not by these unwritten rules, but by the rules prescribed in fundamental documents, including the Charter of the United Nations. And those that are guided by their own interests and the interests of their partners. They do not impose anything on anyone. They do not create any military blocks, but create conditions for joint effective development. This will be the focus, he said, of Russia's work as BRICS chair next year. Now, that's Putin speaking about the question of the direction of world strategic policy. And he said that before, but he went on to make it even more clear when talking about the situation of the puppets of the United States and Europe. And let me have the second slide, please. Putin said many European public figures on the surface are acting like Charles de Gaulle, who was fighting for the interests of France with weapons. He assembled all the French people to show resistance to the occupying forces. However, in practice, they, referring to European leaders, are acting like Marshal Pétain. Even though he was a hero of World War I, in World War II, Pétain was a Nazi collaborationist. He accepted the will of the occupying forces. Almost everyone in Europe behaves this way, except for a few people. Fico, the new leader in Slovakia, Viktor Orban in Hungary. I have said many times that they are not pro-Russia politicians, they are pro-national. They are defending their country's interests, but there are too few politicians like this. I do not know why they do not exist. Maybe this has to do with Europe's excessive dependence on the big brother, the United States. But we are ready to build relations with them. And then he spoke more directly about the United States. And Dennis brought this up earlier, but I'm going to read you this quote again. Putin said, "We are ready to build relations with the United States as well. We believe that America is an important country on the world stage. But this absolutely imperial policy the country pursues is bad for them, not even for us. Why? Because the public expects them to act like an empire. And if they agree to compromise on something or concede something to someone, their voters will see this as a failure or a flaw. That may partly be the reason the elites have to act this way. As soon as they change on a deeper level and begin to respect other people, other countries, start searching for compromises instead of addressing their problems by using sanctions and military force, which would create the underlying conditions for restoring full-fledged relations, so far there are no such conditions. But we are ready for this." Now, I think it's clear from just these short quotes from Putin that what you see is that Putin is talking about the post-unipolar order, the end of this fraud of the rules-based order, and the emergence of a new strategic architecture, which takes as its fundamental concern the benefit of the other, which is, of course, in the tradition of what Lyndon LaRouche was talking about with the Council of Florence, the intervention of Nicholas of Cusa, and the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that ended the 30 Years' War, which was based explicitly on this Christian principle of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That defines a complete shift away from the dictatorship of the unipolar order. Now, we'll take a look at another case study, the European Council Summit, which took place over the last couple of days. There's a great deal of hoopla about Ukraine in this. Would Ukraine be brought into the European Union? Will there be more money from the European Union pledged to Ukraine? And what happened is that on the question of accession of Ukraine and Moldova to the European Union, that was voted in favor. And this led to a wild celebration. The idea that Ukraine would be brought into the European Union. But there are some problems with it. First of all, it's going to take a while. Secondly, this may be too costly for the European Union, whose member nations are all suffering from economic crises. The ability to work out problems on agricultural subsidies and all sorts of other things, plus the fact that Ukraine is in a war and may not survive the war, all of these things make this somewhat of a hollow victory. And it was only achieved by what people are generally calling a bribe given to Viktor Orban, that the EU released money that was being withheld from Hungary. And Orban walked out of the meeting, so he didn't vote against the accession of Ukraine, but later spoke against it afterwards. But the second issue shows the real problem. The idea of 50 billion euros to be given to Ukraine over the next 4 years to survive or to continue the current war, the NATO proxy war against Russia, that was blocked by Orban so that no vote took place. So the question is, with the aid blocked to Ukraine from the United States and from the European Union, what's going to happen to that country? Well, we could also ask the question, what's going to happen to the European Union? The popularity of the member governments are collapsing. The coalitions that represent the last elections are barely surviving. We saw the Wilders vote in the Netherlands. Here in Germany, what do we see? We see a complete collapse of what's called the traffic light coalition, the red, green, black coalition. The problem in Germany is that there's no way to get a budget compromise without the three parties, the Liberal Democrats or the Free Democrats, the Social Democrats, and the Greens. They all have completely contrary views. How do you deal with a budget deficit? Well, the Constitution of Germany has this debt break, which says you cannot go into debt beyond a certain level of GDP. And they're way above that now. So the question is, will the Social Democrats allow cuts in social welfare programs? Will the Greens allow cuts in the so-called transition to green economy? which, by the way, is a complete disaster because Germany's energy bills are going through the roof. Corporations are leaving. There's a deindustrialization. And will the Free Democrats allow an increase in taxes, which goes against their very essence, to provide funds for development? And what's missing in the whole discussion is how should a nation handle a debt problem? Merely cutting the budget, and this, by the way, should be thought about in terms of the United States, which has a larger deficit problem than Germany. If you stop spending, you cut off the future. The Hamiltonian system, LaRouche's American system, depends on credit for physical economic advance, especially oriented towards science and technology, innovation, and infrastructure. But if you have a narrowly defined debt brake or black zero policy of not allowing deficits to occur, where's the future come in? And this is why the situation in Germany is becoming hopeless. So by just looking at these situations, we see on the one hand Putin dealing with these kinds of questions by addressing this move into a new global geometry, while we see the EU and the United States stuck in the unipolar order of war, permanent austerity economies, central bank dictatorship, and no exit strategy from this collapse. This is the City of London geopolitical doctrine that dominates the discussion. And that is why they don't allow you to see this underlying dynamic which is emerging. So the options are either we go along with the proposals and fight for the proposal of Helga Zepp-LaRouche of a new strategic and development architecture for the world, or we end up with permanent war, permanent depression. And that's the choice facing people in the United States and Western Europe and the whole world. Much of the world has already decided, in particular the global South, to go ahead into a new order, breaking away from this order of war and austerity. What will happen in the United States and Western Europe? It's not clear. It's largely going to depend on what you decide to do in the weeks and months ahead. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and weekly magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.